three great presentations. We're going to follow it up with about a 35-minute question and answer, hopefully informal type presentations or discussion. I'm going to probably ask the first 2 or 3 questions to get it started, and then open it up to the audience, and hopefully it'll be fairly informal type of discussion. So just going to throw this out to the panel in general and say, we've talked a lot about some of the problems in Virginia with developing projects, and as we know, there's a big goose egg as far as the level of megawatts that are active in Virginia. And so I'm throwing the question out is why have projects not been built in Virginia today? Whoever wants to take that question first.
I'll take a stab at it to start. I think first of all it takes time, and that's just a statement of fact. It takes time. I think some other states have got out in front of us and started a little earlier. The other 2 things I would point to, I think Mark Hansen kind of put his finger on a little while ago. Because you need a local permit, there are significant challenges there, and that is a precursor to applying for the state permit. There are some states where maybe you have one large landowner, and you get them under lease, and basically at that point you're ready to get it state. So that makes a big difference. And there can be some improvements made there, and I think Carol's and John's efforts regarding model ordinances, are along the line to help improve that process. And then finally, I think there's, some debate as to what extent we're 4 some years into the RPS. I think there's some debate as to what extent that, serves as a proper economic driver.
Excuse me, I think Don has captured that quite completely. One thing, having been engaged in some fashion with wind in Virginia for 10 years, I think we've seen, I don't know if I'd call it a sea change, but certainly different attitudes in Richmond. And I agree with Don. I think our legislators, our administration has not been as quick to engage or support wind in ways some of the surrounding states have. And so we're catching up.
Okay. What kind of build-out might we have in Virginia, and how extensive is the developable resources for wind in Virginia? So, it's, from a developer perspective, you probably have a pretty good clue. I'm sure John and Carol have opinions on this as well.
I'll take a stab at it. But from my perspective, not as a developer, and it's the reason why I showed some of these graphics to try to get the point across that while we have some good winds, they are not all congregated in one place. Or the winds on land tend to be one-dimensional, sort of vast plains as you'd see in the west. They tend to run along ridges, and one of the concerns that Don and I would hear when we were working more closely together some years ago from folks who would look at those wind maps and say, oh, by golly, if we approve a wind farm here, all of our ridge lines are going to be full of wind turbines. Then where are we? When the reality is, either because of the fact that a lot of those lands are public and that proximity to transmission is a critical factor, there really is a much more limited set of opportunities for land-based wind. And so I think what we're going to see in Virginia, as projects start to go up, are going to be projects that are distributed around the state, at least in the region where the winds are stronger, and they're going to be on the order of tens of, maybe over 100 megawatts. I suspect that the PBR is going to have some influence on how large a project gets built as well, and there may be benefits, or there may be constraints imposed by working above or below the 100 megawatt threshold.
do you see any resistance by the utilities in trying to achieve that goal?
We do know that at least one of our major utilities is serious about getting into the wind development process themselves. They already own portions of wind projects in other states, and they have been seriously looking at sites in Virginia that they would themselves develop. And they are looking at other renewables as well. They have both AEP, known as Appalachian in Virginia, and Dominion have been very active participants in all of our RAPs, and have certainly been reliable partners in our deliberations.
I was going to pick up on the build-out question. Of course, it's almost two separate questions with onshore and offshore, right? And at least regarding onshore build-out, I think John rightfully pointed out some of the restrictions. For instance, we have 2 million acres of national forest in Virginia, from about Harrisonburg to run down the 81 down to Southwest Virginia. So there's a lot of national forest, and again, John identified that those are publicly held lands and typically considered somewhat off limits. To the extent I'm aware, the developers have focused on public land areas onshore, and I think that we're going to have a pretty robust build out. I don't know the magical number. I don't think we have as much wind potential as Pennsylvania or West Virginia, but I think that if you consider Virginia in the context of let's say North Carolina down through the Carolinas, we have as good or better wind. So, some of the constraints might be likely viewed as, opportunities to interconnect. And we're already seeing in some places in the Mid-Atlantic where transmission line runs to a certain place, and the developer might be in the queue to plug their project onto that line, and once it sort of reaches a capacity, maybe they can take 50 megawatts more or 100. Well, that's all that's going to be put on that line unless the line is upgraded. So there could be other wind resources and a good place to build close to that, but there are circumstances where the transmission line in a good windy area is really not capable of taking more than a developer is already in the queue to put onto that line. So those are some other constraints.
And Bruce, we tend to look at utility scale projects when this type of question is asked, but there's also, I think, a very significant opportunity in Virginia for community scale projects. And certainly to say nothing of residential, but we've tried to tier our permit by rule so that the smaller projects, smaller used in the non-Virginia sense, of course, we can proceed, with certainly little, if any, requirement from the state for our type of permit.
That's a good point. Some of those projects which would use what we might define as intermediate-sized turbines could be more suitable in the areas where the winds aren't as strong, maybe aren't suitable for commercial wind development, the larger turbines. But one topic that hasn't come up this morning is the net metering law that we have in Virginia, how that might impact smaller community scale projects. The commercial limit was increased recently, I think in the last session, so that's a viable option for smaller users like commercial farm, golf courses, vineyards, they all have an opportunity there where they have a lot of land, but not necessarily the kind of wind resource you'd see on a ridge.
Yeah, it is a very good point that Carol brought up, and because the 5 megawatt de minimis exemption now exists, you might begin to see a market in Virginia arise that could be focused on, let's say, 3 1.5 megawatt General Electric turbines, and sites that could range from wastewater treatment to manufacturing, federal facilities, prisons, things of this sort. So I think that we'll start to see a market get defined in that niche right there.
Is there a developer group out there for that size project? What's that situation in
Those
Virginia?
projects, there is not a developer that I know of in Virginia that focuses on that size, but the one that is working with Tangier, a company out of New York, that's their bread and butter. They install one-offs, ski areas, schools, facilities like that. And I think their range is from about 10 kilowatts, 100 kilowatts is where they really like to work, and up to about 660.
Okay, why don't we open up the questions to the audience, and we get started right over there.
I was just curious, who can we write to change the, I guess to John Miles, to change the federal requirement where you can't put wind turbines on federal lands? That seems like a huge impediment to the Richmond.
The challenge there, without going into a great deal of detail, is that there are and have been for quite some time draft siting guidelines that Fish and Wildlife Service have developed. There has been a federal advisory committee that has reviewed those and has taken comments. Brad, maybe you can, is Brad out there?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I'm not working on those siting guidelines, so.
We would probably be the right place to go to find out what the status is as far as that's concerned. But really, I think to summarize at this moment, there is just a fair bit of uncertainty in terms of how this administration, the federal government, wants to move in that direction, or whether it wants to move in that direction, whether the agencies are aligned in terms of how they want to support projects on federal lands. So there was a company not from around here that has had some development experience that was exploring a potential project on federal lands in Shenandoah County, and it was not particularly well received, at least once that project proposal became public, and all they had done up to that point was to ask the Forest Service for permission to install measuring devices. But I think that was an example, Don can probably speak to this, where they would have done themselves a lot of good by reaching out to the community before taking some actions that would be perceived as toward development.
And Mark, I would add that I don't know the right person to write to, for instance, but to the extent that you could become familiar with the federal offshore process, I would suggest that there's a relation buried in there, and that is that those potential projects might occur on water, but it's using federal public submerged lands, as opposed to your question, I think, is directed toward federal lands.
Well, all the ridge tops is where the good wind is, and the Appalachian Trail, Parkway, I don't know if right to them or.
I don't know about the AT&T Parkway. I think their position's pretty clear, but I guess I would